Welcome to this lecture on Altmetrics and Retractions. Science is built on a simple but powerful idea. Knowledge improves over time, researchers test ideas, other researchers verify them, and occasionally mistakes are discovered. When serious problems are found, scientific papers are usually corrected or retracted. But what happens after a paper is retracted? Does it simply disappear from public discussion? Or does it continue influencing? In this lecture, we'll follow the life of scientific knowledge through Altmetrics, because Altmetrics helps us track how research spreads through society, not only inside academia, but across the wider online world. Imagine reading a headline about an exciting new scientific breakthrough. You share it with colleagues. A journalist writes about it, thousands of people discuss it online. Then months later, the paper is retracted. What happens to all that attention? This is why studying retracted research is so important. Throughout this lecture, I'd like you to remember just 3 simple ideas. First, attention does not equal trust. A paper may receive enormous attention because it's controversial, surprising, or even wrong. Second, retractions travel. Retracted papers often continue circulating online long after the scientific record has been removed. And finally, context matters. The reason why a paper was retracted strongly shapes how researchers, journalists, and the public react to it. If you remember only these 3 ideas from today's lecture, you'll already understand much of what Altmetric reveals about retracted science. Before looking at retractions, let's briefly understand what Altmetric actually measures. Most researchers are familiar with citations. A citation tells us that another scholarly publication has referred to earlier research. But citations accumulate slowly. It usually takes months and years after a paper is published to receive citations. But Altmetrics are different. Instead of measuring a scholarly use, they measure attention. Imagine a paper is published today. How long does it take before people begin talking about it? Does it take years or months? It usually, in reality, is a couple of hours. That's exactly what Altmetrics helps us understand. They capture where research is being discussed across online platforms such as social media, news outlets, blogs, Wikipedia pages, and so on. Altmetrics therefore help us understand how research moves through society before scholarly attention begins to present itself via formal citations. Now let's consider another important question. Are all retractions the same? Not at all. Some papers are retracted because of honest mistakes, perhaps a statistical error or an incorrect dataset. Others involve fabrication, plagiarism, image manipulation, ethical violations, problems during peer review, or publisher error. Each reason tells a different story. Some suggest the scientific knowledge simply needed correction. Others indicate serious failure of research integrity. Recognizing these differences is essential because the public often reacts differently depending on what actually happened. And that's exactly where our next step begins. How can we organize these many different reasons into something we can analyze systematically? So far, we've established that not all retractions are alike, but there are about 112 retraction reasons on Retraction Watch. And to make sense of them, we needed a more simpler way to describe them. So we grouped these reasons together and created 7 broader dimensions. Here you can see what is more central reason stated inside each dimension. And as you see, there are some particular reasons that are more central to each. So for example, in the category or the dimension of unreliable research, there is unreliable research and conclusions, or concerns and issues about data. Duplication of images and concerns about referencing attributions are more central retraction reasons in fabrication and manipulation. Concerns and issues about peer review is growing, also in the category of peer review and publishing dimension. Patient consent and other breach of journal policy and lack of approvals are also more central to the category of ethics and compliance, and so on. So another question is that have these dimensions remained stable over time or are they changing? The answer is that they are changing, and the changes themselves tell an important story. This figure shows how the relative importance of these 7 dimensions have evolved over the years relative to each other. One pattern stands out in particular. Since the widespread adoption of generative AI tools, we see a noticeable rise in retractions related to peer review and publishing, as well as investigation and legal processes. That does not necessarily mean AI is directly causing all of these retractions. Instead, AI appears to be changing the publishing environment. It has become easier to generate manuscripts, manipulate parts of the publishing process, and produce large number of submissions. As a result, journals have also increased investigations and become more active in identifying problematic publications, but changes in retraction reasons raise another question. Do different kinds of retractions attract different kinds of public attention? The answer is yes, and this is one of the central ideas of this lecture. Retractions are not all equal from the perspective of public attention. So imagine 2 papers. One is retracted because a simple statistical error that changes the result. The other is retracted because of investigators discovering fabricated images, fake peer review, or deliberate misconduct. Although both papers have been retracted, they are unlikely to generate the same public response. Cases involving misconduct often become news stories in their own right because they involve controversy, accountability, and questions about research integrity. In contrast, honest mistakes may receive relatively little public attention, even when correcting them is scientifically very important. On the other hand, different platforms behave very differently because they serve different communities and different purposes. Think of each platform as different audience. Wikipedia is primarily an educational source. Wikipedia discussions tend to focus more on investigations, legal cases, and questions of research ethics. Specialized scholarly platforms such as peer review services and F1000 host academic sleuths who naturally pay closer attention to cases involving fabrication, manipulation of images and figures, and research quality generally. Meanwhile, social media platforms such as X tend to respond much more broadly. They often react to whatever is new, surprising, controversial, or widely discussed, regardless of the specific reason behind the retraction. So all metrics are not one single metric. They represent many different kinds of attention coming from many different communities, each looking at science from its own perspective. Once we understand that different communities react differently, another important question follows. When do they react? Is public attention mostly before a retraction or after that? Let's now compare 2 very different online platforms, traditional news media and social media represented by Twitter or X. Their behavior reveals something fascinating. News organizations tend to pay more attention after a paper has been retracted. Journalists begin asking new questions. What does it mean for science and for public? Social media often behaves differently. Platforms such as X are much more focused on new discoveries, exciting findings, spread rapidly immediately after publication on X when the paper is still considered valid. Often the paper is retracted. Public attention often moves on to the next headline. Neither role is inherently better. They simply serve different purposes. Together, they just give a more thorough picture of scientific information travels through society. If news organizations become more interested after a retraction, what does that look like in practice? Let's examine the timing of news coverage more closely. This figure tells a surprisingly encouraging story. Many people assume that once inaccurate scientific findings appear in the news, they are rarely corrected. And that's not correct. A substantial proportion of news coverage actually occurs because of the retraction itself. In other words, journalists frequently return to the story when important corrections are made. Of course, there are 30% of cases where a paper received attention before retraction, but they receive no follow-up coverage and keep circulating just like that. However, the broader pattern shows that science journalism often contributes to correcting the public record, but something else changes after retraction. Not just the amount of news coverage, but the way journalists tell their story. The narrative surrounding a scientific paper evolves over time. When the paper is first published, the headlines usually focus on discovery. As concerns begin to emerge, the narrative shifts to reporting uncertainty and ongoing investigations. And once it is retracted, the story becomes about research integrity. Finally, many articles move into the stage of reflection and talking about how science can improve. So this progression from discovery to reflection is actually one of science's strengths. Science credibility develops on its willingness to recognize and correct them. And that raises one final research question. Are all disciplines equally vulnerable to scientific misinformation in the news? Let's make all of this more concrete by looking at a real example. A few years ago, a paper published in Nature made an extraordinary claim. The author reported that many scientists had been searching for decades a room temperature superconductor. If true, this discovery could have transformed modern technology from energy transmission to medical imaging and quantum computing. So not surprisingly, the paper attracted numerous attention. Researchers discussed it, journalists reported it, and people around the world shared the news. In Altmetrics terms, it became one of the most visible scientific papers of its time. But as other scientists tried to reproduce the findings, concerns began to emerge. Questions were raised about the data and reliability of the results, and all the investigations led to it being retracted. What makes this case especially interesting is that the story did not end with the retraction. The expression of concern came out, and formal retractions came out, and along with them, there was news and social engagement with the paper. So this example is a good example to show how a paper can have several chapters in its lifetime, like from discovery, excitement, scrutiny, to retraction and continued discussion. So Altmetrics allow us to observe each of those chapters as they unfold. Throughout this lecture, we've seen papers attract thousands of online mentions, but none of those indicators tell us whether the science is actually correct. A paper may receive enormous attention because it presents an important breakthrough, an extraordinary claim, or because it's being criticized or retracted. The real value of Altmetrics lies in helping us understand how research moves through society, how information spreads, and how retractions are or are not communicated to different audiences. When interpreted carefully and in the context, Altmetrics becomes a powerful complement to traditional research evaluation. So keep in mind, attention is an indicator of visibility and not validity. So let's return to the question we asked at the beginning of this lecture. What happens after a paper is retracted? The answer is that the story usually continues. Retractions are not the end of the publication's life. Today we've learned that Altmetrics helps us observe that journey. We've also learned 3 ideas that I hope you'll remember. First, attention is not the same as trust. Second, retractions continue to travel through society. And third, the reason for retraction matters because it shapes how people interpret and respond to scientific information. Science is often described as self-correcting enterprise. Retractions are one of the mechanisms that make that possible. But for self-correction to benefit society, the corrections must also reach the public who encountered the original claims. In the future, you'll continue learning about impact of AI on retractions. Thank you for watching.